Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Word Slingers. Today we have a special guest, Clint Stoker.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's nice to meet you. This is the
Yeah,
first time we streamed, right? I just have to check.
yeah.
I'm pretty sure. Okay.
No, yeah, this is
Yeah.
our first time.
I said that once. Oh, it's nice to meet you. It's the first time we streamed. Like we streamed like a year ago. I was like, oh no, I'm an idiot. So yeah,
No, yeah,
good to stream with you.
I get it. Yeah, it's cool. So today we're going to talk about just writing in general, and then of course your project. The link is below in case anybody out there wants to check out his Indiegogo. So
Cool.
yeah, tell us about yourself, Clint. How'd you get started in writing?
Yeah. So I guess you could say I started with writing music, which
Oh,
is
cool.
totally unrelated, and at the same time it is related. But
Right.
I played in a band, and my favorite part about it, like consistently and growingly over time. That wasn't a very good way to say that, but it ended up being writing songs, and so I would kind of got to this point where I actually felt restricted by the format of music in being able to say more. And so I decided to jump into writing novels. And so my first novel I self published in 2011. And it was a learning experience. It was terrible. It was just an awful
Yeah.
book.
What was
Uh,
it about?
it was called The Cause, and it was basically like a dystopian world that had basically one rule. Well, e- everything was great there. It was a city. You never had to sleep, so you could pursue your career to your fullest extent during the day, and at night you could pursue your whatever social aspirations to their fullest extent. And it was like pure happiness, except for there's one thing: it's illegal to feel guilt. And so the whole premise of it was just that like there's avoiding guilt, and if someone felt guilt, they had to be removed from society. And so um, I still think it's an interesting concept. I just did a
It is.
terrible. It was so bad, like so bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, from there I wrote a follow-up novel, brand new story, not related to The Cause. It was called All for Owen, and that was quite a bit better, significant step up. And then from there, I love comic books and been trying to sort of get into writing them for a number of years, but it was like, how do you get an artist? It's expensive. And so, yeah, I made some attempts to get into writing comics. And then finally, with Downcast, that was my first successful comic book that I created and published. So, and then that leads me to where I am today.
That's cool. How hard was it for you to make that transition from writing novels to comic book?
It wasn't. I mean, there's a learning curve for sure. I think it was easier because I had written novels in the past to be able to turn around and apply storytelling principles to comics. And I'm sure it shapes how I write comics because of starting from novels. But I think it was still easier though, as opposed to just starting from scratch directly into comics. So it's sort of a trade off, but I wouldn't change it for sure. I think it helps me have a certain style of writing comics that not everyone has.
Yeah. So Downcast was your first comic book.
It was my first, yeah, published one. I did a
Okay.
few little short stories that never saw the light of day for good reason.
Gotcha.
But yeah, so Downcast was my first, yep, actual completed comic book.
Nice, man. That's cool.
Yeah.
And so you've done Downcast. That's more like a superhero-ish kind of book. Uh,
There's
and,
yeah, definitely elements of that. Yeah.
right. And then Fatal is more of a sci-fi, would you say?
Yeah, there's still I mean, you could make an argument that there's a superhero sort of bend to it, but it's definitely sci-fi. It's more so sci-fi. So it's almost like a space noir crime is kind of
Okay.
how I'd picture it. But comic books just they lend themselves to such great action that you can go really over the top, and so
Yeah.
having super abilities, like you can do a lot with that in comics. And so I can definitely see why superheroes are so popular in general in comics.
Yeah. And then you made the jump to doing horror now with Dracula.
Yeah, that was tough.
Yeah.
that, that was a big shift in gears. So yeah, I mean, it's like it was weird because doing horror, like I in every story I write, I try to have tension and there to be, yeah, just tense moments, and you want to build tension. and there are ways to do that that carry over to horror. But in horror, it's like you have so much free reign to, I mean, if everyone dies at the end, people aren't really going to be disappointed. Like sometimes that's what you want out of a horror, you know, because it's bigger than the happy ending. Yeah. Sometimes there's a happy ending too, but it was definitely challenging. It was a very big change of pace. I had a ton of fun with writing Dracula, but it was. I'm almost surprised at how big of a shift it was from what I was used to doing.
What was the biggest shift? Like, what was the biggest difference in genres?
So it was like how, to me, like a good horror, like there are all these little pieces that build up to manipulating how people feel when they read it. Like the whole point of it is to make the audience feel scared, feel tense, feel, you know, like that's the point. So yes, there's plot in it and you want to have a story that builds up, but I was constantly thinking, okay, there's this scene happening here that's important for the plot, but what is it doing emotionally to the audience? Because if it's not scary or tense, you know, then people are going to be unsatisfied. Even if you have a great story structure, like it's not really doing its job. And so I've focused so much more on those sort of how am I translating emotion to the reader than I normally would do. So that was challenging, and maybe I'm conceptualizing it different. I know there are people that are super good with writing horror, and it comes very natural to many people. But I'm not one of those people. I think it's you can learn it for sure, but I think it's kind of like comedy in that some people are just really good at writing comedy, you know, and you can learn some things, but there's just this knack for it that you can't really quantify it, you know. So I'm really proud of Dracula and how it turned out. Having said that, it was just such a twist from what I'm normally doing. So, but yeah, it was fun.
Right. No, definitely the genre has like an expectation.
Yeah.
That's built into it. The audience goes into expecting to feel something, right?
Yeah.
Your emotion.
And especially with Dracula too, because everyone has preconceived notions of Dracula. And I've heard like instantly people were like, oh, I hope you could do this with Dracula. Oh, I hope you do this. And once I started hearing that stuff, it was like, oh, this is terrifying because I'm going to disappoint all of you because I'm going to do this with Dracula. You know, I'm doing something completely different. Yeah. So I think that added to it. If I was doing my own horror that had no preconceived notions, maybe it would be different, but this was particularly challenging book.
And that's what I was gonna say is like horror alone already has its expectations, but you add in the element that's Dracula. Yeah, it has all this history already. Yeah, and how do you do that? How do you handle that?
Right. Yeah. So I try to look back at, well, what was Dracula? Like it's going back to the roots to Bram Stoker's Dracula, his version. And, you know, critiques on Bram Stoker's Dracula, it's very slow paced. Like it's a slow burn story, you know, there's not tons of action, and that's sort of counterintuitive to what comics do. Right. So that in and of itself was this big negotiation on, I want to have the same kind of slow burn build tension, but at the same time, I need it to feel faster paced than Bram Stoker's Dracula for sure. I need a little bit more visual payoff that you're not getting in the original story. And so there's definitely this, just negotiation on how do I best handle it. And I wanted to definitely have the original Dracula be the source of inspiration as opposed to all the numerous other Dracula stories, which are fantastic. There's a lot of great Dracula stories, but I think the purpose of it was to go back to Dracula's roots with Bram Stoker and take elements from that. So it was super fun. There are things in there like, you know, stake through the heart and garlic and those kinds of elements that were important in the original story. But the reason they were so effective at the time is because it was unheard of. Like it was a unique concept, and it's sort of strange, and it puts people off a little bit. You know, that's what adds to the creepiness. If I just use those kinds of elements in Dracula today, they don't have the same impact. They have a completely different impact because everyone already has context on what that means. Right. So I have some of those elements, but I had to introduce some new things, so that some new tools, I guess, for horror that would that the attempt is to make readers feel a little off, a little unsettled, and to build tension because they don't know what they have to do with this guy Dracula,
Right.
So it's fun, but also hard. It's difficult.
I imagine.
Yeah.
So what was your process like when you tackled this book?
Yeah. This was definitely a rewrite process, is like overall how I would describe it. I've sort of settled into this. I write full script, but I try to purposely build in components that make it loose, so it's not too, I'm not totally sticking to the story structure, and we have to have this happen in this act and this happen in this act. I try to make it a little bit more loose because that makes it more interesting for me to write. And even my process with writing books, when readers get to it, they seem to enjoy those kinds of books I write that way better. So I do that. But with Dracula, it was, hey, I have an idea of how I'm going to approach Dracula. I wrote it out, and then I take a step back and look at it. I had a lot of time to write it. I wasn't, I didn't have a crowdfunder going or anything like that for it, so I could take my time. But I would go back and look at it after letting it sit for a month, and I'm like, this is not it. So I threw it all away, start over. I think I did that 3 times before I settled on this Dracula story that survived. So it was, a lot of rewriting, full script, but intentionally adding ways for me to sort of freeform write in places. I know where I need to go from point A to point B, but just let my imagination run wild during that. And I think that's what my process.
Cool. Have you ever, maybe this is the book, but have you ever written a book to where you're like, I don't know how to go forward from here? Like you hit that wall and you just kind of step away from it and have to come back to it like several times.
Oh yeah.
Or maybe you write the issue, like the whole issue, like 4 or 5 times before you're done with it.
Yeah, that's pretty common for me. I like to think it's common for a lot of writers, but I don't know for sure. But I run into where you kind of write yourself into a corner.
Yeah.
And really the best solution, just like you said, you have to just put it away. Maybe write something else, work on a different project, and come back to it later with fresh eyes. That helps. And sometimes the answer is you just gotta throw it away. The way that I think works well for me to be efficient and getting through the story is I will pick those important plot points. I know for a scene, basically I make a list of what that scene needs to achieve. And it's usually a list of 4 things most of the time, 3 or 4 things. And however I achieve those things, I also need to achieve them, in the most interesting way possible. So, or in the case of horror, it was the most tense or tension building way possible. So I'll usually have a goal for the character. They have a internal struggle, sort of like their emotional, like what's going on in between their ears. And then there's the external struggle, which is the obvious plot points they have to get through, that'll propel them forward through the story. And then usually I also have goals for other characters, like the villains in the story. And so I'll just be very specific with what I'm going to achieve in this this particular scene, write through it, make sure it worked. Sometimes I change it or throw it away, or sometimes I have to move those goals. Like, hey, I achieved 2 goals in this. That 3rd one is not happening here. Therefore, I need to create a new scene, or I need to change this scene. And I think that way, this more of a checklist way of writing, right, helps me to be able to have a little bit more freedom, as opposed to like outlining it out exactly how it should go, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to have to try that because I do that a lot. I hit that wall and I'm just like, I don't know how to move forward from here. Or I've written the whole issue and I'm just like, no, I don't like it. I need to do it all over again.
Writing's hard.
But it's fun.
It is. But yeah, it's such a it's like I think I'm getting better at it, but it still doesn't. It's everyone is just problem solving, and you gotta work it through and make it work. And it's funny how sometimes certain just stories or certain scenes are so difficult and you really work really hard for it, and some come really easy. And I don't know, I have found that if I'm pretty consistent with my process and I feel good about it, it usually ends up making the audience feel good about it, the readers feel good about it. So I don't know, it's funny though, but I think it has little to do with how much time you spend on that particular scene. It just, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, no, I agree. So what genre have you done so far that you really enjoyed the most?
So yeah, that's a great question. I don't think a lot about genre when I go to start out a story. I think about what kind of themes I want to explore, and it tends to be that'll lead me back to sci-fi and dystopia, because I think just because I can make the freedom to make the rules of the universe or that society whatever I want, and I really enjoy that. It's not intentional. I keep thinking I want to write a comedy at some point, like just tackle it. I got to do a comedy, and I actually have a couple ideas for a comedy I'd love to do. I even, call me crazy, I think it'd be fun to do a romance, again, just for the challenge of, I don't like to read romances myself, but the writing challenge would be really interesting. So I want to do that eventually before I die. It'll probably be a long time before I do, but yeah, I tend to hover around the sci-fi dystopia for the most part.
That's cool. So earlier you were talking about internal struggle of the character. How do you convey that in a comic book? Because I was thinking it's easy to convey in a novel because that's what we hear. We're hearing the internal voice all the time. But
yeah,
in a comic book, you really don't see a whole lot of thought bubbles nowadays. But that used to be, and you really don't see too much of that anymore.
Yeah. Thought bubbles they're fun. Like it's a nostalgic component. I don't want to offend anybody. It's a nostalgic component for me with comics, and I love reading. You'll read like a comic from the 80s and there's thought balloons and it's fun. I think that there are more effective and more natural feeling ways in comics to show internal struggle, and it comes down to having conflict between characters. So the way I would do that is I'd pick, for example, look at Downcast. For every single issue or every major story arc, I have a goal, a character arc, and a theme I kind of want to explore for each character. In Downcast, Volume 1, the whole story arc technically was Volume 1 and Volume 2. They created one story arc. But for Jax, he was afraid, and he would hesitate. And like this, it was this theme that he was sort of not ready for the problems that came his way. And the way that I wanted to resolve that is that you show it by having conflict between him and Joanne for the most part, that, hey, you hesitated. Hey, you're not doing this. You're going to be bait. Like, people are going to come after you. And then it resolves with him being more proactive. No, I'm going to go after them. He's stepping into his role, and it's sort of a coming of age sort of story arc. For Joanne, she's dealing with her father being gone and her being in charge and what she's supposed to do with that. And so I'll sort of go through every single character and come up with, again, that checklist of, hey, this scene I need to show Jax failing, here, that shows, that'll sort of underline that internal struggle he has. I need to show Joanne struggling with wanting to solve all the world's problems and forcing it through, and she's a little too proactive, Yeah. And those will be part of my checklist items. I do the same thing with villains. I think that's important. The more that I've put more thought into that with villains, the better the villains are. And the better the villains are, I think the better the whole story is, honestly.
Definitely.
They're important. So I'll do the same thing. Like, I'll have Carver is one of the villains in this more in the current Downcast story arc I'm working on, and he's got some problems from the past. He's got a complicated past, but how is he? I don't want to ruin anything, but how is he going to progress? And it doesn't mean that he gets better. It just means that he changes. So those checklists are just points in his journey to show where he's at and where he's going. You do that through conflict, dialogue, characters defining each other is more natural than thought balloons, where they will just tell you what's on their mind. When you have a character that says, "What's wrong with you? You're doing this," or whatever. Right. You can find creative ways to just within that conflict show what's going on.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah, I never really thought about using another character to bring that out and have that external communication of what's going on internally.
Yeah. And if you can do it in an action sequence, that's even better. Like that's the best. Yeah.
How do you handle character growth when the comic book series is a series and you got to continue like with that character?
Yeah. So I think they're in an ongoing series, you're going to have some character flaws that just exist. And it's going to be part of that character, something they struggle with a lot, and they'll maybe make some progress with it, but it's just this thing that is there, beyond that, you're going to have other character arcs that you're going to introduce, and you have to make them change. It doesn't mean that they resolve it. It just means that they change, so they're progressing through life. So, for example, let's take Spider-Man, for example. He always has guilt about Uncle Ben, and that's something he doesn't fully resolve. He'll have moments of, where he can come to a little bit more peace with it, and he'll sort of struggle with it, but forever, as long as Spider-Man exists, he's always going to be driven by there's this underlying sense of guilt about Ben. But in any given story arc, he'll have different things that he's dealing with. The one that comes to mind is him and Mary Jane and how they're going to deal with their relationship, and it obviously changes over time, whether where he's at there. But there are all sorts of little things that you can introduce for a character to struggle with and have some kind of resolution at the end, and then that'll sort of lead them into the next story problem, or the next story arc that they might struggle with. So I kind of think of it as, and with Downcast obviously being my longest series, I've had the most experience there, but I think of it as almost like you're weaving a basket. I don't know if that's the best way, or like you're making a braid or something. So you'll have, let's say I'm going to write 6 issues. Okay. In issue 1, I'm going to introduce a problem. Obviously, I don't necessarily want to introduce all the problems all at once because it gets a little confusing. It's an overload. So you're going to introduce a problem. Issue 2, maybe you're going to introduce a second problem, and then you're going to weave back in that first problem just a little. So you'll kind of have like these problems ebbing and flowing, and you might have one end and you have it resolved and you move on, and that's great. But you started, luckily the issue before, you started a different problem now that it has been developing, and so it'll sort of kind of grow as you go. I think it's important to resolve things because readers like that. So most of the time eventually you gotta resolve those problems, but you gotta keep it interesting. You add new little problems, and sometimes those can just be a little conflict that comes up, and it's sort of just foreshadowing it. You deal with it later on you'll kind of weave that back in and it becomes a bigger problem. That's the way I conceptualize it. I hope that makes sense.
Oh yeah, it does. I like that. I like the whole picture of a braid weaving through the story and just adding problem after problem while you're resolving one, but leaving a couple others hanging.
Yeah.
I like that. That's really good. Do you want to pitch us Dracula now?
Sure, yeah. So Dracula is my take on the horror classic. It is not a retelling. It's not a continuation or anything like that. It's just sort of if Dracula existed and he made it to the year 2022, this is what he might be up to. It is a story about John Harker. He just gets engaged. He's a newly made a lawyer, just passed the bar exam. He is freshly engaged to his fiancée Mina, and her brother gets in trouble with the law again. This time he calls John Harker because he's a lawyer. Now he can help his new brother-in-law out. Right. And then he finds out that he has basically messed with Dracula. So John Harker is immediately sucked into the world of Dracula through no fault of his own. And it's sort of up to him to try and get his brother-in-law out of the trouble that he's in and get out alive, basically, away from Dracula. So it's his life gets destroyed pretty quickly in a pretty big way, and he's got to work to sort of resolve that. It is very much like a short story. There's spent a lot of time in Dracula's mansion. He's got a lot of wives, just like he does in the original. Again, super fun to write. Really worked hard on tension building as being important here.
How many pages is this?
It is 50 pages.
And really?
Then 50 pages. Then we have a backup story from Narwhal, actually. Okay. Then that's a 3-page story. So
nice.
And it is self-contained, so I'm not introducing new little threads to weave. It's just, that's why I said, when I mean it's like a short story, it's self-contained. There is a resolution, one that's acceptable for a horror story, and it's been a lot of fun. So
is the setting different? Is I know the time is different. Is the setting?
Yeah. So yes, and yes. It is. It takes place in current time. It takes place here in America. So Dracula is actually an immigrant, and he comes from the Romanian area or Transylvania, and he lives in America, and he's very much like a Jeffrey Epstein type character. I think that's exactly who Dracula would be. Super rich. People don't know much about him. He's extremely powerful, and you kind of don't understand the depths of his what he's willing to do to get what he needs, which is blood in this case, but blood and control over people.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. What advice would you give a young aspiring writer?
So first, this is going to sound, I hope not condescending or stupid, but you have to write. That's the first thing. Writing comics is expensive. It's difficult. Usually how do I need an artist or something like that. You can worry about that. You'll solve those problems. But what you got to start off with is writing. If you want to write comics, start writing scripts with the thought in your mind that it eventually will get drawn. It may or may not, and that's okay. But you have to be writing, work on the craft. Even if you draw something yourself and it'll never be published, that's okay. Spend the time, draw it yourself. If you want to go through that process, that is all going to help you, but you have to start writing. And really, you're going to get better if you're writing every day. I wish I could do it every day right now, but I'm not quite there. I used to write, when I was writing novels, I was writing every single day. But yeah, that'll help you improve and look at the craft, and just, if you focus on the craft and write, getting the rest of the stuff in place will come. You'll get there. You'll work on it, but don't wait to get an artist before you start writing. You got to get started now.
That's right. This is my brother here. He says, any interest in taking on any other monsters? Mummy, Werewolf, or Frankenstein?
So I've had a few people bring this up. I think if I did, I could see doing almost like this short story, like there's a link through of them all. So like Clint Stoker's Dracula, doing Frankenstein, doing The Invisible Man could be fun. It's not high up on my priority list because I have a lot of stuff to write, so I'm not opposed to it. But I do want to see how Dracula is received by readers, and that'll kind of inform if I want to go that direction. So no plans right now, but I'm open to it.
Cool. So which is your favorite monster? Let me ask you that.
I've always loved Frankenstein. I read the book when I was in junior high, and it just struck me as completely different from what I had thought Frankenstein was. The book was just different than, I don't know, I guess what media had evolved into. So that was a really fun story. I love Dracula. Yeah, The Invisible Man. This was like junior high for me, reading through all these kinds of books. So I did read Dracula as well. Yeah, I Am Legend is probably my favorite vampire story, I gotta say. And so I think I got a little bit of inspiration from that as well for Dracula. Not a lot, just a little bit though. It was pretty interesting. But yeah, I think Frankenstein probably is my favorite.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that book.
It's great.
Yeah, it is.
It's like electric ills and like I don't know, that it starts off with him in Antarctica or no, was it the North Pole or something like that? Like it's just really interesting. The whole thing was interesting to read.
Yeah. Yeah, I had this idea of like a continuation of the story, where it'd be like Frankenstein's monster versus zombies, where someone else tries to replicate what he does, but ends up creating zombies.
Oh yeah, that would be fun. Yeah.
Yeah. In the future sometime.
Yeah.
What's your next project after this?
Yeah, so I'm working on Downcast 4. We're actually pretty far into it, so I have some decisions to make on how long this is going to be. Since it's an ongoing series, it's always tempting, like, wow, I'll just add another issue into this story arc, and so. But yeah, we're about 2 issues into the next Downcast right now. It still needs to be colored and lettered, but we're making some good progress. Fatal it's in a pretty crucial stage right now. We're getting really close to finishing up with it. So that's been fun and a ton of work. Beyond that, I'm actually kind of waiting. So I'm purposely not taking on any more writing projects. I've got an idea for a comedy, and I have an idea for another sort of sci-fi dystopia, and both of them I just want to do both of them. So I probably will. But yeah, no, we're not getting started yet on either of those.
Okay. Very cool. Anything else you want to
add? Yeah, I just appreciate you having me on. It's what I love, what's refreshing is actually talking about writing. I know I did a lot of talking today, but it's so fun to talk about the mechanics of writing to me, and it's important, and I think it doesn't get respected enough as a craft, especially in comics. Like, you look at the artwork and it's just so visual, and artwork's great and it's important, don't get me wrong, but talking about writing, I think, is huge. So yeah, I don't know if you watch much, like on YouTube they have Brandon Sanderson will do like lectures. He'll record lectures that he has given in college courses and things like that. And those are super helpful. There's like a lot of good information out there on writing, but it's criminally underviewed,
Yeah. Oh yeah, I enjoy the art side because I do both. I do the art and the writing, but I've really been trying to dig into the writing side of things and learn as much as possible. And I think doing this show is it's kind of selfish because it's for me. Like, I like asking these questions because I want to learn.
Oh, that's great.
But I think it's also a useful tool to have like this information out there for any new artist or new writer who wants to learn and hear what writers like yourself have to say about the art of writing.
Absolutely, Matt. I'm envious. I would love to just draw my own book. I'll go back and forth with like, no, okay, I'm going to work on my drawing and start developing a style, and it's just it's so cool, like the freedom that you have with that, and yeah, I think it's awesome. So
well, likewise, like I'm envious of guys like you who can just like write such great books.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's I don't know, it helps just the experience of like doing it, and with comics, I'm super fortunate just in that I've had enough artists to work with and have found enough success in crowdfunding that it gets paid for. I don't go, I'm not going broke to make them.
Right.
I'm super fortunate, and that's a sad thing about comics is when you have those opportunities, you're going to improve more because you can finish books. Yeah. And so you do need those, but I don't want to discourage anybody. Like, you work on the writing first. You'll get there. Like, it'll come. You just have to keep working on it.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Clint, for being on here.
Yeah, appreciate it. Great talking to you.
Yeah, great talking to you too. I'm sure I'll have you on again in the future.
Sounds great. Yeah.
All right, everybody, thank you for watching.
Bye.
Bye.